The Swiss Family Robinson by Johann David Wyss. Chapter 2. A Landing and Consequent Occupations. By daybreak we were all awake and alert, for hope as well as grief is unfriendly to lengthened slumbers. When we had finished our morning prayer, I said, "We now, my best beloved, with the assistance of heaven, must enter upon the work of our deliverance. The first thing to be done is to give each poor animal on board a hearty meal. We will then put food enough before them for several days. We cannot take them with us, but we will hope it may be possible, if our voyage succeeds, to return and fetch them. Are you now all ready? Bring together whatever is absolutely necessary for our wants. It is my wish that with our first cargo should consist of a barrel of gunpowder, 3 fowling pieces, and 3 carbines, with as much small shot and lead, as many bullets as our boat will carry, 2 pairs of pocket pistols and 1 of large ones, not forgetting a mould to cast balls in. Each of the boys and their mother also should have a bag to carry game in. You will find plenty of these in the cabins of the officers." We added a chest containing cakes of portable soup, another full of hard biscuits, an iron pot, a fishing rod, a chest of nails, and another of different utensils, such as hammers, saws, pincers, hatchets, augers, etc. And lastly, some sailcloth to make a tent. Indeed, the boys brought so many things that we were obliged to reject some of them. When all was ready, we stepped bravely each into a tub. At the moment of our departure, the cocks and hens began to cluck, as if conscious that we had deserted them, yet were willing to bid us a sorrowful adieu. This suggested to me the idea of taking the geese, ducks and fowls and pigeons with us, observing to my wife that if we could not find means to feed them, at least they would feed us. We accordingly executed this plan. We put 10 hens and an old and a young cock into one of the tubs and covered it with planks. We set the rest of the poultry at liberty, in the hope that instinct would direct them toward the land, the geese and ducks by water, and the pigeons by the air. We were waiting for my wife, who had the care of this last part of our embarkation, when she joined us, loaded with a large bag, which she threw into the tub that already contained her youngest son. I imagined that she intended it for him to sit upon, or perhaps to confine him so as to prevent his being tossed from side to side. I therefore asked no questions concerning it. Each of us had useful implements within reach. The hand of each held an oar, and near each was a swimming apparatus in readiness for what might happen. The tide was already at half its height when we left the ship, and I had counted on this circumstance as favourable to our want of strength. We held the 2 paddles long ways, and thus we passed, without accident, through the cleft of the vessel into the sea. The boys devoured with their eyes the blue land they saw at a distance. We rowed with all our strength, but long in vain, to reach it. The boat only turned round and round. At length I had the good fortune to steer in such a way that it proceeded in a straight line. The 2 dogs, perceiving we had abandoned them, plunged into the sea and swam to the boat. They were too large for us to think of giving them admittance, and I dreaded lest they should jump in and upset us. Turk was an English dog, and Flora was of Danish breed. I was in great uneasiness on their account, for I feared it would not be possible for them to swim so far. The dogs, however, managed the affair with perfect intelligence. When fatigued, they rested their forepaws on one of the paddles, and thus with little effort proceeded. Jack was disposed to refuse them in this accommodation, but he soon yielded to my argument that it was cruel and unwise to neglect creatures thrown on our protection, and who indeed might hereafter protect us in their turn by guarding us from harm and assisting in our pursuit of animals for food. Besides, added I, God has given the dog to man to be his faithful companion and friend. Our voyage proceeded securely, though slowly, but the nearer we approached the land, the more gloomy and unpromising its aspect appeared. The coast was clothed with barren rocks, which seemed to offer nothing but hunger and distress. The sea was calm, the waves gently agitated, washed the shore, and the sky was serene. In every direction we perceived casks, bales, chests, and other vestiges of shipwrecks floating round us. In the hope of obtaining some good provisions, I determined on endeavouring to secure some of the casks. I bade Fritz have a rope, a hammer, and some nails ready, and to try to seize them as we passed. He succeeded in laying hold of two, and in such a way that we could draw them after us to the shore. Now that we were close on land, its rude outline was much softened. The rocks no longer appeared one undivided chain. Fritz, with his hawk's eye, already described some trees and exclaimed they were palm trees. Ernest expressed his joy that he should now get much larger and better coconuts than those of Europe. I, for my part, was venting audibly my regret that I had not thought of bringing a telescope that I knew was in the captain's cabin, when Jack drew a small one from his pocket and with a look of triumph presented it to me. The acquisition of the telescope was of great importance, for with its aid I was able to make the necessary observations and was more sure of the route I ought to take. On applying it to my eye, I remarked that the shore before us had a desert and savage aspect, but that towards the left the scene was more agreeable. When I attempted to steer in that direction, a current carried me irresistibly toward the coast that was rocky and barren. By and by we perceived a little opening between the rocks near the mouth of a creek, towards which all our geese and ducks betook themselves, and I, relying on their sagacity, followed in the same course. This opening formed a little bay. The water was tranquil, and neither too deep nor too shallow to receive our boat, and cautiously put on shore at a spot where the coast was about the same height above the water as our tubs, and where at the same time there was a quantity sufficient to keep us afloat. The shore extended inland in something of the form of an isosceles triangle, the upper angle of which terminated among the rocks, while the margin of the sea formed the base. All that had life in the boat jumped eagerly on land. Even little Francis, who had been wedged in his tub like a potted herring, now got up and sprang forward, but with all his efforts he could not succeed without his mother's help. The dogs who had swum ashore received us as if appointed to do the honours of the place, jumping round us with every demonstration of joy. The geese kept up a loud cackling, to which the ducks from their broad yellow beaks contributed a perpetual thorough bass. The cocks and hens, which we had already set at liberty, clucked. The boys, chattering all at once, produced altogether an overpowering confusion of sounds. To this was added the disagreeable scream of some penguins and flamingos, which we now perceived some flying over our heads, others sitting on the points of rocks at the entrance of the bay. The first thing we did on finding ourselves safe on terra firma was to fall on our knees and return our thanks to the Supreme Being who had preserved our lives, and to recommend ourselves with entire resignation to the care of His paternal kindness. We next employed our whole attention in unloading the boat. Oh, how rich we thought ourselves in the little we had been able to rescue from the merciless abyss of the waters. We looked about for a convenient place to set up a tent under the shade of the rocks, and having all consulted and agreed upon a place, we set to work. We drove one of our poles firmly into a fissure of the rock. This rested upon another pole, which was driven perpendicularly into the ground, and formed the ridge of our tent. A frame for our dwelling was thus made secure. We next threw some sailcloth over the ridge, and stretching it to a convenient distance on each side, fastened its extremities to the ground with stakes. Lastly, I fixed some tenterhooks along the edge of one side of the sailcloth in front, that we might be able to enclose the entrance during the night by hooking in the opposite edge. The chest of provisions and other heavy matters we left on the shore. The next thing was to desire my sons to look about for grass and moss, to be spread and dried in the sun to serve us for beds. During this operation, in which even the little Francis could take a share, I erected near the tent a kind of little kitchen. A few flat stones I found in the bed of a fresh water river served for a hearth. I got a quantity of dry branches, and with the largest I made a small enclosure round it. With the little twigs added to some of our turf, I made a brisk, cheering fire. We put some of the soup cakes with water into our iron pot, and placed it over the flame, and my wife, with her little Francis for a scullion, took charge of preparing dinner. In the meanwhile, Fritz had been reloading the guns. With one of which he had wandered along the side of the river, he had proposed to Ernest to accompany him. But Ernest replied that he did not like a rough stony walk, and that he should go to the seashore. Jack took the road towards a chain of rocks, which jutted out at sea, with the intention of gathering some of the mussels which grew upon them. My own occupation was now an endeavour to draw the 2 floating casks on shore, but in which I could not succeed, for our place of landing, though convenient enough for our machine, was too steep for the casks. While I was looking about to find more favourable a spot, I heard loud cries proceeding from a short distance, and recognised the voice of my son Jack. I snatched my hatchet and ran anxiously to his assistance. I soon perceived him up to his knees in water in a shallow, and that a large sea lobster had fastened its claws in his leg. The poor boy screamed pitiably and made useless efforts to disengage himself. I jumped instantly into the water, and the enemy was no sooner sensible of my approach than he let go of his hold and would have scampered out to sea, but that I indulged the fancy of a little malice against him for all the alarm he had caused us. I turned quickly upon him and took him up by the body and carried him off, followed by Jack, who shouted our triumph all the way. He begged me at last to let him hold the animal in his own hand, that he might himself present so fine a booty to his mother. Accordingly, having observed how I held it to avoid the grip, he laid his own hand upon it in exactly the same manner, but scarcely had he grasped it than he received a violent blow on the face from the lobster's tail, which made him lose his hold, and the animal fell to the ground. Jack again began to bawl out, while I could not refrain from laughing heartily. In his rage, he took up a stone and killed the lobster with a single blow. I was a little vexed at this conclusion to the scene. This is what we call killing an enemy when he is unable to defend himself, Jack. It is wrong to revenge an injury while we are in a state of anger. The lobster, it is true, had given you a bite, but you on your part would have eaten the lobster. So the game was at least equal. Another time, I advise you to be both more prudent and more merciful. But pray, Father, let me carry it to my mother, said Jack, fearless now of further warfare, and accordingly he carried it to the kitchen, triumphantly exclaiming, "Mother, mother, a sea lobster! Ernest, a sea lobster! Where is Fritz? Take care, Francis, he will bite you." In a moment all were round him to examine the wonderful creature, and all proclaimed their astonishment at his enormous size, while they observed that its form was precisely that of the common lobster so much in use in Europe. Ernest, ever prompted by his savoury tooth, bawled out that the lobster had better be put into the soup, which would give it an excellent flavour. But this his mother opposed, observing that we must be more economical of our provisions than that, for the lobster of itself would furnish a dinner for the whole family. I now left them and walked again to the scene of this adventure, and examined the shallow. I then made another attempt upon my 2 casks, and at length succeeded in getting them into it, and in fixing them there securely on their bottoms. On my return, I complimented Jack on his being first to procure an animal that might serve for sustenance, and promised him for his own share the famous claw which had furnished us with so lively a discussion. "Ah, but I have something too that is good to eat," said Ernest, "and I should have got it if it had not been in the water, so that I must have wet my feet." "Oh, that is a famous story," cried Jack. "I can tell you what he saw, some nasty mussels. Why, I would not eat one of them for the world. Think of my lobster." "That is not true, Jack, for they were oysters and not mussels that I saw. I am sure of it, for they stuck to the rock, and I know they must be oysters." "Fortunate enough, my dainty gentleman," interrupted I, addressing myself to Ernest. "Since you are so well acquainted with the place where such food can be found, you will be so obliging as to return and procure us some. In such a situation as ours, every member of the family must be actively employed for the common good, and above all, must not be afraid of so trifling an inconvenience as wet feet." "I will do my best with all my heart," answered Ernest, "and at the same time I will bring home some salt, of which I have seen immense quantities in the holes of the rocks, where I have reason to suppose it is dried by the sun. I tasted some of it, and it was excellent. If you do not wish to dine upon a soup without flavour, you had better run and fetch a little quickly," I said. He set off and soon returned. What he brought had the appearance of sea salt, but was so mixed with earth and sand that I was on the point of throwing it away. But my wife prevented me, and by dissolving and afterwards filtering some of it through a piece of muslin, we found it admirably fit for use. "Why could we not have used some sea water?" asked Jack, "instead of having all this trouble?" "Sea water," answered I, "is more bitter than salt, and has besides a sickly taste." While I was speaking, my wife tasted the soup with a little stick, with which she had been stirring it, and pronounced that it was all the better for the salt, and now quite ready. "But," said she, "Fritz is not come in, and then how shall we manage to eat our soup without spoons or dishes? Why did we not remember to bring some from the ship?" "Because, my dear, one cannot think of everything at once. We shall be lucky if we have not forgotten even more important things." "But indeed," said she, This is a matter which cannot easily be set to rights. How will it be possible for each of us to raise this large boiling pot to his lips?" I soon saw that my wife was right. We all cast our eyes upon the pot with a sort of stupid perplexity, and looked a little like the fox in the fable when the stork desires him to help himself from a vessel with a long neck. Silence was at length broken by all bursting into a hearty laugh at our want of every kind of utensil, and at the thought of our own folly in not recollecting that spoons and forks were things of absolute necessity. Ernest observed that if we could but get some of the nice coconuts he often thought about, we might empty them and use the pieces of shells for spoons. "Yes, yes," replied I, "if we could but get, but we have them not, and if wishing were to any purpose, I had as soon wish at once for a dozen silver spoons. But alas, of what use is wishing?" "But at least," said the boy, "we can use some oyster shells for spoons." "Why, this is well, Ernest," said I, "and is what I call a useful thought. Run then quickly for some of them. But, gentlemen, I give you notice that no one of you must give himself airs because his spoon is without a handle, although he chance to grease his fingers in the soup." Jack ran first, and was up to his knees in the water before Ernest could reach the place. Jack tore off the fish with eagerness and threw them to Ernest, who put them into his handkerchief, having first secured in his pocket one shell he had met with of a large size. The boys came back together with their booty. Fritz not having yet returned, his mother was beginning to be uneasy, when we heard him shouting to us from a small distance, to which we answered by similar sounds. In a few minutes he was among us, his 2 hands behind him, and with a sort of would-be melancholy air which none of us could understand. "What have you brought?" asked his brothers. "Let us see your booty, and you shall see ours." "Ah, I have unfortunately nothing." "What, nothing at all?" said I. "Nothing at all," answered he. But now, on fixing my eye upon him, I perceived a smile of proud success through his assumed satisfaction. At the same time, Jack, having stolen behind him, exclaimed, "A sucking pig! A sucking pig!" Fritz, finding his trick discovered, now proudly displayed his prize, which I immediately perceived, from the description I had read in different books of travels, was an agouti, an animal common in that country, and not a sucking pig as the boys had supposed. "Where did you find him? How did you get at him? Did he make you run a great way?" asked all at once the young brothers. Fritz related that he had passed over to the other side of the river. "Ah," continued he, "it is quite another thing from this place. The shore is low, and you can have no notion of the quantity of casks, chests, and planks, and different sorts of things washed there by the sea. Ought we not to go and try to obtain some of these treasures?" "We will consider it soon," answered I, "but first we have to make our voyage to the vessel and fetch away the animals. At least you will agree that of the cow we are pretty much in want." "If our biscuit was soaked in milk, it would not be so hard," observed our dainty Ernest. "I must tell you too," continued Fritz, "that over on the other side there is as much grass for pasturage as we can desire, and besides, a pretty wood in the shade of which we can repose. Why then should we remain on this barren desert side?" "Patience," replied I. "There is a time for everything, friend Fritz. We shall not be without something to undertake tomorrow, and even after tomorrow. But above all, I am eager to know if you discovered, in your excursion, any traces of our ship companions." "Not the smallest trace of man, dead or alive, on land or water. But I have seen some other animals that more resemble pigs than the one I have brought you. but with feet more like those of the hare. The animal I am speaking of leaps from place to place, now sitting on his hind legs, rubbing his face with his front feet, and then seeking for roots and gnawing them like a squirrel. I have not been afraid of his escaping me. I should have tried to catch him with my hands, for he appeared almost tame. Soon after we had our meal, the sun began to sink into the west. A little flock of fowls assembled round us, pecking here and there what morsels of our biscuit had fallen on the ground. Just at this moment, my wife produced the bag she had so mysteriously huddled into the tub. Its mouth was now opened. It contained the various sorts of grain for feeding poultry, barley, peas, oats, etc., and also different kinds of seeds and roots of vegetables for the table. In the fullness of her kind heart, she scattered several handfuls at once upon the ground, which the fowls began eagerly to seize. I complimented her on the benefits her foresight had secured for us, but I recommended a more sparing use of so valuable an acquisition, observing that the grain, if we kept for sowing, would produce a harvest, and that we could fetch from the ship's spoiled biscuit enough to feed the fowls. Our pigeons sought a roosting place among the rocks. The hens, with 2 cocks at their head, ranged themselves in a line along the ridge of the tent, and the geese and ducks betook themselves in a body, cackling and quacking as they proceeded to a marshy bit of ground near the sea, where some thick bushes afforded them shelter. A little later we began to follow the example of our winged companions by beginning our preparations for repose. First we loaded our guns and pistols and laid them carefully in the tent. Next we assembled together and joined in offering our thanks to the Almighty for the succour afforded us, and supplicating his watchful care for our preservation. With the last ray of the sun we entered our tent, and after drawing the sailcloth over the hook to close the entrance, we laid ourselves down close to each other on the grass and moss we had collected in the morning. The children observed with surprise that darkness came upon us all at once, that night succeeded day without an intermediate twilight. This, replied I, makes me suspect that we are not far from the equator, or at least between the tropics, where this is of ordinary occurrence. I looked once more out of the tent to see if all was quiet around us. The old cock, awaking at the rising of the moon, chanted our vespers, and then I lay down to sleep. In proportion as we had been during the day oppressed with heat, we were now in the night inconvenienced with the cold, so that we clung to each other for warmth. A sweet sleep began to close the eyes of my beloved family. I endeavoured to keep awake till I was sure my wife's solicitude had yielded to the same happy state, and then I closed my own. Thanks to the fatigue we had undergone, our first night in the desert island was very tolerably comfortable. Chapter 3. Journey of Discovery. I was roused at the dawn of day by the crowing of the cocks. I awoke my wife, and we consulted together as to the occupations we should engage in. We agreed that we would seek for traces of our late ship companions, and at the same time examine the nature of the soil on the other side of the river, before we determined on a fixed place of abode. My wife easily perceived that such an excursion could not be undertaken by all the members of the family, and full of confidence in the protection of heaven, she courageously consented to my proposal of leaving her with the 3 youngest boys, and proceeding myself with Fritz on a journey of discovery. I entreated her not to lose a moment in giving us our breakfast. She gave us notice that the share of each would be but small, there being no more soup prepared. "What then," I asked, "is to become of Jack's lobster?" "That he can best tell you himself," answered his mother. "But now pray awake the boys, while I make the fire and put on some water." The children were soon roused. Even Ernest submitted to the hard fate of rising so early in the morning. "It is impossible for all of you to go," I said. "We know not yet what we are to set about, nor whither we are going. Your eldest brother and myself shall be better able to defend ourselves in any danger without you. Besides that, with so many persons we could proceed but slowly. You will then all three remain with your mother in this place, which appears to be one of perfect safety, and you shall keep Flora to be your guard, while we take Turk with us. With such a protector and a gun well loaded, who shall dare treat us with disrespect? Make haste, Fritz, and tie up Flora, that she may not follow us, and have your eye on Turk, that he may be at hand to accompany us, and see the guns are ready." "Need not be uneasy about their journey," said Ernest. "Like Robinson Crusoe, they will be sure enough to find some coconuts, which they will like much better than your miserable lobster. Only think, a fine round nut, Jack, as big as my head, and with at least a teacupful of delicious sweet milk in it." "Oh, brother Fritz, pray do bring me some," cried little Francis. We now prepared for our departure. We each took a bag for game and a hatchet. I put a pair of pistols in the leather band round Fritz's waist, in addition to the gun, and provided myself with the same articles, not forgetting a stock of biscuit and a flask of fresh river water. My wife now called us to breakfast, when all attacked the lobster, but its flesh proved so hard that there was a great deal left when our meal was finished, and we packed it for our journey without further regret from anyone. Fritz urged me to set out before the excessive heat came on. "With all my heart," said I. In about an hour we had completed the preparations for our departure. I had loaded the guns we left behind, and I now enjoined my wife to keep by day as near the boat as possible, which in case of danger was the best and most speedy means of escape. The banks of the river were everywhere steep and difficult, excepting at one narrow slip near the mouth on our side, where we had drawn our fresh water. The other side presented an unbroken line of sharp, high, perpendicular rocks. We therefore followed the course of the river till we arrived at a cluster of rocks, at which the stream formed a cascade. A few paces beyond, we found some large fragments of rock, which had fallen into the bed of the river. By stepping upon these, and making now and then some hazardous leaps, we contrived to reach the other side. We proceeded a short way along the rock we ascended in landing, forcing ourselves a passage through tall grass, which twined with other plants, and were rendered more capable of resisting by being half dried by the sun. Perceiving, however, that walking on this kind of surface in so hot a sun would exhaust our strength, we looked for a path to descend and proceed along the river, where we hoped to meet fewer obstacles and perhaps to discover traces of our ship's companions. When we had walked about 100 paces, we heard a loud noise behind us, as if we were pursued, and perceiving a rustling motion in the grass, which was almost as tall as ourselves, I was a good deal alarmed, thinking that it might be occasioned by some frightful serpent, a tiger or other ferocious animal. But I was well satisfied with Fritz, who instead of being frightened and running away, stood still and firm to face the danger, the only motion he made being to see that his piece was ready, and turning himself to front the spot whence the noise proceeded. Our alarm was, however, short, for what was our joy on seeing rush out not an enemy, but our faithful Turk, whom in the distress of the parting scene we had forgotten, and whom no doubt our anxious relatives had sent on to us. I received the poor creature with lively joy, and did not fail to recommend both the bravery and discretion of my son, in not yielding to even a rational alarm, and for waiting till he was sure of the object before he resolved to fire. Had he done otherwise, he might have destroyed an animal likely to afford us various kinds of aid, and to contribute by the kindness of his temper to the pleasures of our domestic scene. We pursued our way. On our left was the sea, and on our right the continuation of the ridge of rocks, which began at the place of our landing and ran along the shore. The summit everywhere adorned with fresh verdure, and a great variety of trees. We were careful to proceed in a course as near the shore as possible, casting our eyes alternately upon its smooth expanse and upon the land in all directions, to discover our ship companions, or the boats which had conveyed them from us. But our endeavours were in vain. Fritz proposed to fire his gun from time to time, that should they be anywhere concealed near us, they might thus be led to know of our pursuit. Would be vastly well, I observed, if you could contrive that the savages, who are most likely not far distant, should not hear the sound and come in numbers upon us. When we had gone about 2 leagues, we entered a wood situated a little farther from the sea. Here we threw ourselves on the ground, under the shade of a tree by the side of a running stream, and took out some provisions and refreshed ourselves. We heard the chirping, singing, and movements of birds in the trees, and observed as they now and then came out to view, that they were more attractive by their splendid plumage than by any charm of note. Fritz assured me that he had caught a glimpse of some animals like apes among the bushes, and this was confirmed by the restless movements of Turk, who began to smell about him, and to bark so loud, and the wood resounded with the noise. Fritz stole softly about to be sure, and presently stumbled on a small round body which lay on the ground. He brought it to me, observing that it must be the nest of some bird. "What makes you of that opinion?" said I. "It is, I think, much more like a coconut. But now let us break the shell, and you will see the nut inside." The nut, alas, from lying on the ground had perished, and appeared but little different from a bit of dried skin, and not the least inviting to the palate. Fritz was much amused at this adventure. "How I wish Ernest could have been here," cried he. "How he envied me the fine large coconuts I was to find, and the whole teacup full of delicious milk, which was to spring out upon me from the inside." After looking for some time, we had the good luck to meet with one single nut. We opened it, and finding it sound, we sat down and ate it for our dinner, by which means we were enabled to husband the provisions we had bought. We made a hearty meal, and then continued our route. We did not quit the wood, but pushed our way across it, being often obliged with our hatchet to cut a path through the bushes overrun by creeping plants. At length we reached a plain, which afforded a more extensive prospect and a path less intricate. We next entered a forest to the right, and soon observed that some of the trees were of a singular kind. Fritz, whose sharp eye was continually on a journey of discovery, went up to examine them closely. "Oh, father, what odd trees with wens growing all about their trunks!" I had soon the surprise and satisfaction of assuring him that they were of the gourd tree kind, the trunks of which bear fruit. Fritz, who had never heard of such a tree, could not conceive the meaning of what he saw, and asked me if the fruit was a sponge or a wen. "We will see," I replied. "If we cannot unravel the mystery, try to get one of them down, and we will examine it minutely." "I have got one," cried Fritz, "and it is exactly like a gourd, only the rind is thicker and harder." "It then, like the rind of that fruit, can be used for making various utensils," observed I. "Plates, dishes, basins, flasks. We will give it the name of the gourd tree." Fritz jumped for joy. "How happy my mother will be," cried he in ecstasy. "She will no longer have the vexation of thinking, when she makes the soup, that we shall all scald our fingers." We next proceeded to the manufacture of our plates and dishes. I taught my son how to divide the gourd with a bit of string, which would cut more equally than a knife. I tied the string round the middle of the gourd as tight as possible, striking it pretty hard with the handle of my knife, and I drew tighter and tighter till the gourd fell apart, forming two regular shaped bowls or vessels, while Fritz, who had used a knife for the same operation, had entirely spoiled his gourd by the irregular pressure of his instrument. I recommended his making some spoons with the spoiled rind, as it was good for no other purpose. I, on my part, had soon completed 2 dishes of convenient size, and some smaller ones to serve as plates. Fritz was in the utmost astonishment at my success. "I cannot imagine, father," said he, "how this way of cutting the gourd could occur to you." "I have read the description of such a process," replied I, "in books of travels, and also that such of savages as have no knives, and who make a sort of twine from the bark of trees, are accustomed to use it for this purpose." "And the flasks, father, in what manner are they made?" "If one wishes to have a flask or bottle with a neck, he binds a piece of string, linen, bark of a tree, or anything he can get round the part nearest the stalk of a very young gourd. He draws this bandage so tight that the part at liberty soon forms itself to a round shape, while the part which is confined contracts, and remains ever after narrow. By this method it is that they obtain flasks or bottles of a perfect form." Our conversation and our labour thus went on together. Fritz had completed some plates, and was not a little proud of the achievement. "Ah, how delightful my mother will be to eat from them," cried he. "But how shall we convey them to her? They will not, I fear, bear travelling well. We must leave them here on the sand for the sun to dry them thoroughly. This will be accomplished by the time of our return this way, and we can then carry them with us. But care must be taken to fill them with sand, that they may not shrink or wrap in so ardent a heat." My boy did not dislike this task, for he had no great fancy to the idea of carrying such a load on our journey of further discovery. A service of porcelain was accordingly spread upon the ground, and for the present left to its fate. We amused ourselves as we proceeded in endeavouring to fashion some spoons from the fragments of the gourd rinds. I had the fancy to try my skill upon a piece of coconut, but I must confess that what we produced had not the least resemblance to those I had seen in the museum at London, and which were shown there as the work of some of the islanders of the southern seas. A European without instruments must always find himself excelled in such attempts by the superior adroitness and patience of savages. In this instance, too, of ourselves, we had the assistance of knives, while the savages have only flat stones with a sharp edge to work with. While our labours had been going on, we had not neglected the great object of our pursuit, the making of every practicable a search for our ship's companions. But our endeavours, alas, were all in vain. After a walk of about 4 leagues in all, we arrived at a spot where a slip of land reached far out into the sea, on which we observed a rising piece of ground or hill. A moment's reflection, we determined to ascend it, concluding we should obtain a clear view of all adjacent parts, which would save us the fatigue of further rambles. We accordingly accomplished the design. We did not reach the top of the hill without many efforts and a plentiful perspiration. But when there, we beheld a wild and solitary beauty, comprehending a vast extent of land and water. It was, however, in vain that we used our telescope in all directions. No trace of man appeared. The shore rounded by a bay of some extent, the bank of which ended in a promontory on the further side, the agreeable blue tint of its surface, the sea gently agitated by waves in which the rays of the sun were reflected. The woods of varied hues and verdures formed a picture of such magnificence, of such new and exquisite delight, that if the recollection of our unfortunate companions, engulfed perhaps in this very ocean, had not intruded to depress our spirits, we should have yielded to the ecstasy the scene was calculated to inspire. In reality, from this moment, we began to lose even the feeble hope we had entertained, and sadness stole into our hearts. We descended the hill and made our way to a wood of palms, which I had just pointed out to Fritz. Our path was clothed with reeds, entwined with other plants which greatly obstructed our march. We advanced slowly and cautiously, fearing at every step to receive a mortal bite from some serpent that might be concealed among them. We made Turk go before, to give us timely notice of anything dangerous. I also cut a reed stalk of uncommon length and thickness for my defence against any enemy. It was not without surprise that I perceived a gluey sap proceed from the divided end of the stalk. Prompted by curiosity, I tasted this liquid, and found it sweet and of a pleasant flavour, so that not a doubt remained that we were passing through a plantation of sugar canes. I again applied the cane to my lips and sucked it for some moments, and felt singularly refreshed and strengthened. I determined not to tell Fritz immediately of the fortunate discovery I had made, preferring that he should find it out himself. As he was at some distance before me, I called out to him to cut a reed for his defence. This he did, and without any remark used it simply for a stick, striking lustily with it on all sides to clear a passage. The motion occasioned the sap to run out abundantly upon his hand, and he stopped to examine so strange a circumstance. He lifted it up, and still a larger quantity escaped. He now tasted what was on his fingers. Oh, then for the exclamations. "Father, Father, I have found some sugar. Some syrup. I have a sugar cane in my hand. Run quickly, Father." We were soon together, jointly partaking of the pleasure we had in store for his dear mother and his younger brothers. In the meantime, Fritz kept sucking the juice of the single cane he had cut, till his relish for it was appeased. He persisted in cutting at least a dozen of the largest canes, tore off their leaves, tied them together, and putting them under his arm, dragged them as well as he was able through the thick and thin to the end of the plantation. We regained the wood of the palms without accident. Here we stretched our limbs in the shade and finished our repast. We were scarcely settled when a great number of large monkeys, terrified by the sight of us and the barking of Turk, stole so nimbly and yet so quietly up the trees that we scarcely perceived them till they had reached the topmost parts. From this height they fixed their eyes upon us, grinding their teeth, making horrible grimaces, and saluting us with screams of hostile import. Being now satisfied that the trees were now palms bearing coconuts, I conceived the hope of obtaining some of this fruit in a milky state through the monkeys. Fritz on his part prepared to shoot at them instantly. He threw his burdens on the ground, and it was with difficulty that I, by pulling his arm, could I prevent him from firing. "Ah, Father, why did you not let me fire? Monkeys are such malicious, mischievous animals. Look how they raise their backs in derision of us." To say the truth, I have no predilection for monkeys, which, as you say, are naturally prone to be malicious. But as long as an animal does no injury, or that his death can in no shape be useful in preserving our own lives, we have no right to destroy it, and still less to torment it for our amusement. But what will you say if I show you that we may find means to make living monkeys contribute to our service? See what I am going to do, but step aside for fear of your head. If I succeed, the monkeys will furnish us with plenty of our much-desired coconuts. I now began to throw some stones at the monkeys, and though I could not make them reach to half the height at which they had taken refuge, they showed every mark of anger. With their accustomed trick of imitations, they furiously tore off nut by nut all that grew upon the branches near them, to hurl them down upon us, so that it was with difficulty we avoided the blows. And in a short time a great number of coconuts lay on the ground round us. Fritz laughed heartily at the success of our strategy, and as the shower of coconuts began to subside, we set about collecting them. We chose a place where we could repose at our ease to feast on this rich harvest. We opened the shells with a hatchet, but first enjoyed the sucking of the milk through the 3 small holes where we found it easy to insert the point of a knife. The milk of the coconut has not a pleasant flavour, but it is excellent for quenching thirst. What we liked best was a kind of solid cream which adheres to the shell, and which we scraped off with our spoons. We mixed with it a little of the sap of our sugar canes, and it made a delicious repast. Our meal being finished, we prepared to leave the wood of palms. I tied together all the coconuts which had stalks, and threw them across my shoulder. Fritz resumed his bundle of sugar canes. We divided the rest of the things between us, and continued our way towards home.